A buddy of mine is distraught about the fortunes of his beloved San Francisco 49ers. Last year, Super Bowl finalists, losers in overtime, and just 10 months later, in danger of not even making the playoffs. Same players, same coach, yes, some injuries, but that's how fast it can happen. And when there is this dip in form, it's never just one factor. It's a multitude of things. And that's why I'm a little bit apprehensive heading into this week. Presented by 24/7 Services, let's review some of the funk factors following Chelsea 3, Villa 0. Welcome inside the parlor, and I'm going to be frank, it is very difficult doing this show every 3 days when the results aren't positive. I've always said, if football is affecting your mood to the point where you're miserable week after week, then probably you need to reevaluate your relationship with football. But when it's your life and your livelihood, you can't just opt out, and neither can the players or the manager. You have to stick with it and fight through it. The first thing Unai Emery said after the game was his appreciation to the supporters for transmitting their energy at Stamford Bridge. And that's kind of how I feel. I am indebted to you for watching this show despite weeks now of games that didn't finish with a positive result. This is why I try really hard to make a point of savoring and relishing the great seasons or the great calendar years, like 2023, for example, which was a simply sensational year for Aston Villa Football Club. We got out of the bottom three, ultimately qualified for the Conference League, and because of a couple of really good signings and a great start to the next season, we put ourselves in a position to qualify for Champions League. I think about that first trip to Birmingham in April of 2023 all the time. The energy behind it, the momentum that you could feel in the city, and just how great it was to be there. It was a life-changing trip for me. Upon reflection, and there may have been some clues that we maybe ignored that may have predicted some of this, because 2024 has been very different, and there are still 7 games left to try to turn things around and end the calendar year on a positive note. But as I said off the top, when you go through a prolonged funk like this, it's never just one factor, like some magic silver bullet that you could point to and say, well, that's the reason why. So I want to spend the entirety of this show looking at all the factors that have suddenly conspired to create an awful lot of angst and anger within the fan base, and I'm sure some concern within the club itself. When times get tough and the club goes through a difficult patch, and we've been there before, I like to drift back in time and remind myself of why I fell in love with Aston Villa in the first place. And it was the old Trinity Road stand, among many other things, that just spoke to me on so many levels, which is why I named the show the way I did. But Trinity also means 3. Today, though, I'm breaking format a bit and I'm looking at all the funk factors we need to confront after being comfortably dispatched by Chelsea 3-0. Owen and Pat were in the capital gathering footage for me, and until the last 2 visits, London has been a very happy hunting ground since Unai Emery arrived. In fact, the last Villa League win was at Fulham, but boy, does that feel like a long time ago now. As one might expect, the key numbers leaned heavily to the home side, which is a really good outfit. I thought they were the best team in the league down the stretch last year, and they still fired Pochettino, and they still brought in more high-end talent. But in the past, when Villa didn't have more chances or more possession, that didn't necessarily condemn us to a loss. And the one metric that did surprise me was duels won. 47-34 in favor of Villa. We couldn't seem to convert those into transitional moments, though, and when we did, the breaks just fizzled out, which is something I will certainly address later. Now, first of all, we all need to calm down and consider some critical context. Bad performances are never as bad as we think we thought they were. Similarly, the good performances are never as great as we thought they were. And I look at football as not a 90-minute marathon, but a series of moments that either go for you or against you. And if you think things are bad at Villa Park right now, consider the plight of Manchester City, who have lost 5 straight Premier League games, 7 winless, and they were 3-0 up on Feyenoord at home in Champions League in midweek, only to let that slip and have to settle for a draw. Plus, they have a very uncertain future ahead of them. When there is a sudden and prolonged dip in form, it's time to take a critical view of everything. In fact, the best leaders that I've ever seen or read about always say, confront the cold, hard facts. And that's what I'm about to do. Club ownership. Nassif Sawiris and Wes Edens saved this football club, so some might even suggest that they are above criticism, but it always starts at the top, and during difficult times, everybody has to look in the mirror and understand their role, and unfortunately for our owners, some of the PSR problems we had this summer stem from bad overspending as we tried to invigorate Steven Gerrard as a manager. And I'm talking specifically about Luca Dean, Diego Carlos, Boubacar Kamara, and Philip Coutinho. Kamara and Dean are still getting better, you may argue, but on breathtaking wages. And you could probably even go farther back and look at the overpaying for Emi Buendia. But, at the time, Nassif and Wes put their faith in the people that were making these decisions, and they were still relatively new to all of this. Our owners' desire for Champions League football and being among the global elites in club football is both, I think, warranted and justified, and I want our club to be ambitious. But managing these competitions is taking its toll on what is a relatively thin squad, as many other clubs have already discovered, Newcastle being one of them. But the other thing is, in our quest to try to play with the big boys under the current regulations, we're having to find new commercial revenue streams, and that has disenfranchised many long-term loyal fans. And that becomes much harder to justify when the product on the actual field is slipping. Nassif and Wes have, however, been very proactive of late. First, attracting investment from a big player in Ateros, a silent third partner, if you will, taking almost a third of the club. And just recently, they've also taken out a loan against all of the club's assets in a way of trying to lessen the PSR burden. Like it or not, PSR is what it is. We have to deal with it. And how going into debt is somehow advantageous to sustainability is just a ridiculous discussion to even be having. But that's what the big boys do. Manchester United, what are they, 800 million in debt? And if that's what the big boys are doing, so will we, if that helps us with PSR. And fair play to them. They've been proactive. As much as none of us want to admit it, especially Villa's football operations, selling Luiz and Diaby this past summer, whether they were both PSR moves or not, is greatly impacting us now. And the idea that they have taken out this loan tells me that they have addressed that issue and are confronting that reality rather than hiding from it. And I would not be surprised if they dip into the market this January quite aggressively, even though it's not a good time to buy and the prices for players is often inflated. Monchi and the recruitment team. Our footballing hierarchy had the near impossible task of trying to be PSR compliant by the deadline of June 30th or face a points deduction. And at the same time, they had to rebuild, reinvigorate, and try to refresh a squad that was facing Champions League football in the upcoming season. Bringing in Ian Matson and Amadou Onana were excellent signings, if not expensive ones. Now, Everton fans have long been frustrated with Onana's injury record, which would have certainly been a risk factor. And unfortunately, for much of this season, that has kind of played out a bit. Pretty much everything else we did in the summer, and I realize our backs were against the PSR wall. These were fringy, almost pawn-like moves. When you think about Lewis Doblin, who's barely had a sniff at West Bromwich Albion, Illing Jr.'s on the periphery of Bologna, Enzo Berenachea is playing at Valencia, but none of those three are anywhere close to our first team. And I think you could probably say the same for Joe Gauci, Kosta Nedeljkovic, and Lino Sousa. But those were low-cost, low-risk moves made in a January window, which happened to be Monchi's first. And now we face the very worrisome reality of an Emi Martinez injury, which, by the way, since he's arrived at our club, we've never addressed. a suitable backup option for him. But then again, what Premier League capable goalkeeper would want to come to us to never play? You see, though, why we need to rotate him every once in a while. Robin Olsen is rumored to be going to Malmo in January, so where's his head at? First he was frozen out, now he's being asked to bail us out. And Joe Gauci still looks like a very inexperienced option to me, even though he is a regular now with Australia. Let's just all say a little prayer that whatever hampered Emi Martinez and brought him off at halftime is not serious. Maybe the biggest issue of all from summer was our alleged chase of Joao Felix. Were we really in on him? Did we have funds set aside to purchase him? Because by the time that super agent Jorge Mendes got into the situation and had him moved to Chelsea, it was too late for us, and now we're paying the price for not having Moussa Diaby or Felix, because that's where the majority of our goals originate from, that number 10 position. And if we anticipated a drop-off in goals for, then maybe the idea of shoring up our backline, particularly the right side, might have been a good idea in hindsight. Instead, we had an awkward situation with Diego Carlos where first he was frozen out in preseason and then he was on the block and then he had to come back and play for us, which is never really ideal. Then there was the decision to buy back Jadon Philogene from Hull for about $14 million, which at the time felt like a shrewd move. But this is a player who, at this moment in time, has not lived up to either the expectation or the purchase price. And we all know what Philogene is capable of. He's quick, he's tricky, he's willing to do the defensive work. But he was also the culprit on the 1-0 goal as he coughed it up. And lo and behold, we're down again early, having to chase a game. Leon Bailey having no legitimate competition on the right-hand side of the park is a big problem. Number one, he's not got competition. So does that drop his levels? But also, we just don't have options, and Bailey's being relied upon too much. Every club is trying to do the same thing with every single player that walks through the door. You try to make them an appreciating asset, whether they're an academy prospect or a senior pro. Buy them cheap, young, develop them, coach them, graduate them to the senior team, or sell them for more than what you paid for. Rory Wilson was our most prized asset in this club, and now we've frozen him out because apparently his wage demands are breathtaking. And I agree, you need to set standards within your club, but man, losing a player like that for nothing would be a tremendous waste of time and resources. Needless to say, like every other passport-holding member of Villa Nation, the 24/7 services crew is a little bit glum at the moment and somewhat concerned. But thankfully, being awesome at the job site and being finicky about high-quality work is a very pleasant distraction from 8 without a win. Now, I happen to know a very high-profile member of the Villa family who watches this show, and because of that, called up 24/7 services to do some work at his house, and for one reason or another, something happened that wasn't satisfactory. It does happen in the business. And Paul Handsaker, being such a stickler for quality and having happy clients, they rectified the situation immediately to complete satisfaction. And because of that, the chances that this particular client may call on 24/7 services again in the future will increases exponentially. And that's the vision that Paul and the company has. Create repeat customers or even intergenerational family clients. And that's what's happening right now. And it's funny, many of them are Villa fanatics. You don't have to be a Villa fan, by the way, but, you know, it doesn't hurt. And I think it's important that we as a nation of Villa fans support one another in our business endeavors. Besides, misery loves company. Unai Emery. When things aren't going well, a good leader will look in the mirror, not out the window, looking to blame somebody else. And this is how I see Unai Emery. Reflective, very self-critical, and I believe the people he's brought in to work around him are not yes men. Monchi, Damian Vidagani, Paco, I think those guys were brought in to offer different perspectives and opinions, potentially from his. But we also have to remember the entire kingdom is built around Unai. He only answers to the owners everybody else has to answer to him. Extending his contract through 2029 was a prudent move from a stability standpoint, but could it also allow for some complacency? I honestly do not think so, because everything you hear is that Emery is a relentlessly driven and motivated individual. A good friend of mine, Michael Finley, is the manager of Bermuda's men's national team, which actually has an Aston Villa player in its pool, Ajani Burchill, who's in our U21 program. Mike took his UEFA Pro license with the English FA, so he's well connected. He knows a lot of the people in the English game. In fact, John Terry was on his course. And one thing he said to me that I'll never forget when Unai Emery was first hired is that players of demanding managers do tend to have burnout phases. And as I reflect on what's happening right now, that point could be, somewhat salient. When things are going well, which for the most part they have done under Unai Emery. I mean, it's been since October 22nd and the win over Bologna that we've been winless, but otherwise it's not been bad. And during those times, you can understand why he might have ridden his guys. To use some cliches, dance with the one who brung you, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And we managed to avoid the injury bug through much of 2023. He inherited most of that squad with the exception of Alex Moreno, brought in that January window. And so you can understand how consistency and continuity was a really good thing for quite a while. When things turn, however, you could ask questions about the fine line between consistency and stubbornness. And I'm loath to criticize anything about Unai Emery because he is one of the best managers in the world. This is an area where internally, there should be some reflection. And a great example is Ian Maatsen. Considering how much we spent on him this summer, would it kill us to play him in a more attacking role on the left-hand side? Because we don't have a natural left-sided player right now without Jacob Ramsey. And we are missing directness, pace, trickery, which we know Maatsen could bring, while still being responsible defensively. But the reluctance to introduce fresh legs more often and maybe earlier in games is either down to the realization that we don't have enough depth and quality in the squad, or a loss of trust by the manager for certain players. And maybe the best example of all is Emi Buendia. What a horrible injury. And worse was the timing of it, because Buendia was flying in the preseason before last year. And now he's been resigned to getting basically garbage minutes. I don't see him starting in any of the big competitions, and I'm not sure what it'll take to get him there. And if you're only resigned to those garbage minutes, well, guess where your head is going to be at? How are you supposed to make meaningful contributions? Now, the biggest question the outside world would ask of Unai Emery, I'm not sure if it's the same discussion internally, is whether John Duran should be playing more and instead of Ollie Watkins at times. And arguably, it's Duran's goals earlier this season that still incredibly have us within touching distance of the top places in both the Premier League and the Champions League. Whenever Duran plays on his own instead of Watkins up front, we look like a completely different team, and playing them together simply has not worked to this point. It's a clunky, awkward situation, damned if you do, damned if you don't, and it brings us back to the trust issue. How does a player earn trust? By playing meaningful minutes. How does a player play meaningful minutes? By earning the manager's trust. I also realized that Unai Emery has tweaked his system ever so slightly over the summer, and it's just not fluent yet and not ideal that Amadou Onana has been unavailable for a lot of this season because he's a key cog. And I also realized that it's probably a good idea to not sit still tactically and become stale, because other teams can figure you out. But when we're conceding goals at the rate that we are now, that means we have to score 2 or 3 goals every week, and we're not capable of doing that either right now. Now, it may still come, but at the moment, as I said last week, we're a neither nor team. Not scoring, not defending. I was hoping we could at least extend the defensive sensibilities from the Juventus game into Sunday. We couldn't even keep that up for 10 minutes against Chelsea. Ollie Watkins. Did you know our Ollie holds the dubious distinction of having missed more big chances than anyone else in the Premier League up until this point in the season? 13, and there was another one on Sunday at Chelsea. The Blues had scored, and then in minute number 20, he does the hard part by fleecing the defender to even get into the scoring position. But then this beautifully exemplifies the lack of conviction, confidence, the fact that he's indecisive, imbalanced, and just not ruthless right now. And yet he's getting these chances, which is maybe why Unai Emery is so reluctant to drag him. In fairness, Watkins kind of hobbled into the season without even having much of a preseason after England duty. He had a couple of chances at West Ham, 2 glorious ones at home to Arsenal. Was that to be a harbinger of his season to come? Because if he converts even 3 of those 13 big chances, that might have been enough to swing a couple of results in the other direction. Now, you look at Nicholas Jackson for Chelsea, he scores on his very first chance on Sunday, and that wasn't even considered a big chance. He's bang in form right now after being a little bit inconsistent last year, and there's the difference. One striker in form takes his chances, the other one not quite. Those are the margins. Leon Bailey. Ever since the first preseason games, something has been off with our Jamaican international. He may be the beacon and the metaphor for the entire Aston Villa side. We are predictable. We are slow. We are not dynamic. We don't punish teams. We're not scoring enough goals. He hasn't scored any in the Premier League season. And there was another great example of that in the Chelsea game. Is it fatigue? Is it an injury? Has the rest of the league caught up with his tendencies? Because when you have a dynamic, pacey winger on either side of the park with a scoring, playmaking number 10 between them, pretty hard to defend that. You may be able to stop 1 or 2, but not all 3, and we are nowhere near that right now. Injuries and fixture congestion. I don't consider this a legitimate excuse because everybody has to deal with these issues, and we're going to see it affect more clubs over the coming weeks. But teams that compete in Europe are at a higher risk of injuries, and it just seems like every time a Villa player comes back from injury, another one drops down. And that's been the case for much of this year, and unfortunately, I believe it's going to continue to be the case heading into 2025. I will keep up some appearances with my regular formatting and update the season's subcategories to this point. It is astounding that we are actually now in the negative on goal difference for the season, and you could see that reflected in the 15-minute plus-minus increments throughout the season. The first 15 and last 15 looking increasingly worse by the week. And you think about how we were just 30 seconds from a win and a clean sheet at home to Bournemouth on October 26th in a game we should have won comfortably based on chances, to what has happened since. It's quite something, and I have to admit, I did not see this coming. The Sill Hill Brewery star performers were the Villa legends, who were the guests of honor at the Taproom's Night with European Champions on Friday, which was a total success and maybe a pilot project for future events. Tony Morley, Gary Williams, Des Bremner, all regaling the crowd with tales of past glories, with absolutely deliciously designed, beautifully brewed, lovingly local award-winning beer freely flowing. And I hope that many of the people who attended that night will make Sill Hill's Taproom part of their regular match day routine, maybe as early as this Wednesday for Brentford. Doors open at 4. It's only a 25-minute walk from there to Villa Park, or a 5-minute Uber ride. And if you attended based on the recommendation of the show, or you've had some of their beer because of watching me, I deeply appreciate it, because as I said earlier, as a Villa Nation, it is wonderful when we can support like-minded individuals in their business enterprises. Cheers to everybody who went. How big would back-to-back wins be at Villa Park this week? Well, it would be enormous, a massive boost, and a huge tonic for what ails us at the moment. The problem is Brentford's in relatively good form. They're ahead of us in the table. Oddly, Thomas Frank's team is scintillating at the G-Tech. They've yet to win away from it. Gulp, that worries me. And in Brentford and Southampton, we're now facing back-to-back the teams with the 2 worst away records in the Premier League, and that terrifies me, because now there's expectation from the fans. There's pressure on the players. If you're the away side in either of those games, you're looking at Villa's form going, This team can be had. Let's get after them. Oh, and they have Robin Olsen in goal. Let's go. I'm going to admit I'm very nervous about Wednesday because I was in the house last April when Villa blew a 2-0 lead at home to Brentford and actually had to come from behind to draw 3-3. And I remember sitting there feeling quite demoralized, wondering how on earth could that happen in such a short period of time? What was it? 3 goals in like 10 or 11 minutes? And here we are now thinking from a wider campaign viewpoint, the same thing. How could things have changed so quickly? And as much as I'd like to say stay positive, that's a bit rich coming from somebody who lives 7,400 miles away from the ground and doesn't attend regularly. But I can tell you from a supporter, from a club executive standpoint, the coaching staff, the players themselves, nobody wants to go back to dark and toxic Villa Park. So let's hope that the players find a spark. Maybe a new hero emerges and we can get back to winning ways this week. Until then, be well. Thank you for watching. And as always, up the mighty Villa!